And hi everyone, it's really great to see all of you today, and I'm really very excited to introduce Nicole Eaton, who's an associate professor of history at Boston College. Professor Eaton got her PhD at UC Berkeley in 2013, and she is an expert on the Soviet Union and Germany. She's held many fellowships from Fulbright Hays, the National Council for Eurasian and Eastern Research, DAAD, Kennedy Institute, U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. You get the idea. Her book, German Blood, Slavic Soil, which she's going to be talking about today, came out with Cornell in 2023, and it is really a wonderful book. I highly recommend it to all of you. It is a transnational history, as well as a history of Russian and German entanglement. She is an expert on the Soviet Union and on Germany, and you really get the full sense of all of it in this amazing book. It focuses on Königsberg or Kaliningrad, right? Different names different times, which we'll hear about today. And it is it's a haunting read. So it's I recommend it, but sit down, maybe not on a rainy day. And it is filled with insights about Stalinism, about Nazism, and about the politics of exclusion. Politics of exclusion, something we should all be thinking about all the time in this political moment. So thank you. Let's just give Nicole a
thank you so much to Fran for inviting me and for it turns out helping me get tenure. If we had not done this before, Fran had turned out to be one of my tenured first. Okay. And thank you also to for facilitating this trip possible. And it's my first time in Madison. I'm just delighted. I had a wonderful weather night last night. And as Fran mentioned, I went to UC Berkeley, so another state school with really large at the time and still to some extent to this day area study resources like Wisconsin, and so it's such a delight to see all of you here and to see these ways and all of these interactions, all these opportunities. And I am so fortunate to teach at Boston College, a wonderful institution where I love my colleagues and I love my students, but we don't have that kind of community that a school like this can provide. And I was always a little too busy to go to all the talks I thought I should go to, and I now regret not taking all those opportunities. So I'm glad to see you all taking at least some of these opportunities, and I encourage you to enjoy them now while you're here. And so, mark the time, make sure I don't do 4:05. So today I'm going to talk about my book, about one city and two regimes, and it spans the period we sometimes call Europe's Age of Extremes. But first, I wanted to start somewhere in the middle. And this is, you can see here, the Baltic Sea coast, the former German village of Palmniken. My dark screen is, no, that's not affecting it. The former German village of Palmniken. And today it's the village of Yantarny in Kaliningrad Oblast, means province in Russian. And it's near the furthest west point in Russia today, surrounded by the EU and NATO. The name Yantarny means amber, and this part of the Baltic coastline at that time today produces about 90% of the world's amber, a sort of geological phenomenon. And in late January 1945, this coast, this village, its amber mine became the site of one of the final mass murder actions of the Holocaust. For the previous 5.5 years, the Nazis of this German region, East Prussia, had overseen a vast wartime empire stretching over today's Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine, parts of them. And the Nazis had claimed at first to be rejecting bourgeois European civilization, moral codes. They presented themselves as iconoclasts against all of that when they built their Third Reich. But by the summer of 1944, when the Soviets had dismantled this wartime empire, and when their soldiers had reached the borders of East Prussia, by then the easternmost borders of Germany, the Nazis changed their tune, claiming that the defense of East Prussia and its capital city, Königsberg, meant the defense of European civilization, of European humanism, of individual liberties, of freedom, etc., over Bolshevik Asiatic barbarism. The Soviets launched their full-scale invasion of Germany in January 1945. Within weeks, they captured most of Prussia and encircled Königsberg. Inside this city, which Hitler named Fortress Königsberg, ordered to hold out at all costs, there were nearly 13,000 Jewish prisoners who had been evacuated from the satellite camp of various satellite camps of the Stutthof concentration camp to help build fortifications for the city. As the Red Army approached, the SS shot nearly 3,000 of them, piling their corpses in the streets, and they marched another 5,000 to 10,000, based on our estimates today, to the Baltic Sea coast, to Palmniken. Nearly 2,000 of the prisoners, most of whom were women, died on the march from starvation, from weakness, or from being shot for trying to escape. So-called ordinary Germans, we use this term a lot, young Hitler Youth boys, and old militiamen were called up by the SS to participate in this genocide. A young teenage boy, Martin Bergau, later wrote about how he and his fellow Hitler Youth were given guns and then ordered to march over 3,000 prisoners into the Baltic Sea in order to drown them. Those who tried to swim ashore were shot, and while reportedly at first 200 prisoners survived the freezing cold waters and later escaped after left, when they fled to the nearby village of Palmniken and other villages to seek help, the villagers almost without exception turned these stragglers over to the SS to have them murdered. And only about a dozen women survived because of a few good righteous among the nations. The Palmniken graves were some of the many mass graves that the Soviet Red Army soldiers discovered on their march to Berlin. And Rudolf Folger, a German civilian in Palmniken, later testified about what happened when the Red Army first arrived and discovered this full extent of the massacre of the Jews. The Russians, he said, ordered him to collect a large number of women to dig up the mass grave for the Jews behind the mine building, and then also to round up German men to dig a new mass grave for the victims. The women were first forced to line up along the dead bodies that they had exhumed, and then, as Folger testified, the Russians set up 2 machine guns and pointed them at the grave diggers. Folger recalled that a Red Army officer, quote, a Jew, unquote, made a speech in German, quote, he made it clear that the Russians could do to the people of Palmniken the same thing that had been done earlier to the Jews, but that they would not, because they would not stoop to the level of Hitler's criminals. Folger emphasized this reversal of fates, right? This image of a now powerful Soviet Jewish soldier wielding a gun over powerless German civilians, mostly women, in retribution. But what Folger at the time, and then after in his testimony, could not see was that this particular officer wanted to portray the Red Army's mission as one of humanist socialist liberation, not of barbaric vengeance. But amid the violence of the invasion and the occupation, very few Germans could take such assertions of Soviet moral superiority seriously. Because indeed, as the Red Army marched across East Prussia, they understood themselves to be these liberators of humanity, but they also sought vengeance for the years of war and suffering that their families had endured. After all, 26 million at least Soviet citizens died in the war as either soldiers or civilians, many of them in the Holocaust. And many Red Army soldiers, most of them indeed, sought eye for an eye repayment in East Prussia. They burned down entire villages, they mass raped German women, and they executed German men on the spot. And while some Soviets, and perhaps this Soviet Jewish officer, lamented consent to this violence, that's something I spend a chapter on in the book, looking at attitudes towards this violence. And while some of them lamented it and wondered what it meant for the Soviet project at large, many Soviet soldiers saw this punishment as still inadequate to repay the Germans fully for their crimes. So this encounter at Palmniken is one of the many episodes I describe in this book as Germans and Soviets came together in this place on dramatically changing terms and tried to make sense of their own societies and on the war, about the war that had brought them together. Oh, I've lost my, sorry, my screen has gone black. What am I doing here? Very good. Just a second, I'm sorry. I cannot find my PowerPoint. So there have been, just so you can see the area stretched here, this is Königsberg, this is where and this is the region, or the northern third of East Russia that becomes Kaliningrad, still part of Russia to this day. And so there have been more books written about World War II than can be read in a lifetime, and that's an actual statistic. Most of those that talk about this battle between Germany and the Soviet Union are top-down. They're big decision-making books. They deal with the world of ideas, of dictators, and strategy. And there was also a whole school of totalitarianism studies. We still read some of these, Hannah Arendt, for example, right, who was herself born in Königsberg. And they came out during the Cold War and then presented Nazism and Stalinism as just two sides of the same coin, two reactions to liberal democracy, right? Sort of the more natural liberal democracy and these aberrations. There have been many, many works comparing these two regimes, many of them also very sophisticated, and they've given us all kinds of insights. But in general, comparative histories tend to flatten out nuance. They tend to be structural. They tend to look at a certain government, certain policies in one regime and the other, and they don't make room for local variations and lived experience. And so that's what first drew me to Königsberg, Kaliningrad as an unparalleled way to study these two regimes. Because the city is really remarkable in many ways. It was the easternmost city in the Third Reich. It became the westernmost in the Soviet Union. And it was multiple times over the course of a century, and to an extent this day, isolated as an exclave from the mainland of its revolutionary regime. And it's the only city ruled by Hitler and Stalin, not just in a wartime occupation, but also as part of their quote unquote patrimony. You can argue against that, but in a big sense, that's true. It's also the site, as I mentioned, of one of the bloodiest and most violent battles of the Second World War, and something I spent about half the book on, the largest and longest post-war cohabitation between Germans and Soviet civilians who lived together for over 3 years after the war until the Germans' final expulsion by late 1948. I initially set out to write another structural comparative history as a grad student to show how the Nazis did XYZ, how the Soviets did the same. But I soon realized that this approach was not only unfeasible because many of the wartime and pre-war records had been destroyed, but it was also highly undesirable because the circumstances were so dramatically different. There were as the time changed, so too were the terms. And as you can see, right, you cannot make a comparative history of these two things. And so most importantly, I began to see how these two societies were not acting in isolation, but reacting and responding to each other over time, as you can even see in that Palmnican anecdote that I began with. And so I instead used the case of one city to write an entangled history of Nazism and Stalinism to show how they emerged out of a common context of the interwar world, how their histories were interconnected beyond the confines of state borders. And this was happening in the world of ideas, yes, of fascism versus communism, but also in these very personal on-the-ground encounters. Now, the most famous work that could be considered an entangled history is Tim Snyder's Bloodlands, published in 2010. Highly influential book, much acclaimed, also much criticized for various points of interpretation. But it's made a splash, and it's a book that many people here have read, or maybe family members have read. And now that Tim Snyder's name grows, so too does this book. Bloodlands presents a world that is very much, as the title suggests, between Hitler and Stalin. One in which both dictators made plans on high and then inflicted that radical violence on this region, these bloodlands of Europe between the two regimes. And now I had studied a German city that became Soviet, not part of what we think of as today as East Central Europe, right? It's a sort of peculiarity in there. But I did notice that this portrayal didn't really match my findings in the archives and the story that I was seeing emerging, because it did little to explain this lived experience and the mechanics of violence on the ground, why neighbors kill each other, how they understand what they're doing. And so my book takes a different approach. It shows how in these faraway borderlands of two regimes, the conditions differed very dramatically from those in Moscow and Berlin. That local leaders, I show over the course of the book, operated with great autonomy. They had to adapt national ideologies for local contexts, And their revolutionary experiments could even influence, in multiple cases, the practices of the metropole. I also show how the two regimes, of course, saw themselves as mutual enemies, as competitors, and how they were changing or not changing or hardening their positions in response to the other, and how the layered occupations of Nazi and Soviet rule in the region created conditions for escalating violence and ever more radical politics exclusion. Finally, I was struck, as this opening anecdote shows, by the dramatically different stories that the various protagonists told about what happened and about this place, depending on who was doing the telling and the writing. Histories, memoirs, diaries, testimonies produced by people from Germany or from the Soviet Union or by the victims of either. Each tended to focus on one side of the story until very recently. They were often highly moralizing stories, showing how their own people were heroes or undeserving victims, and the enemy was usually a stock character villain, a flattened Asiatic barbarian, so zoopomorphic Soviet, or a sort of, cruelly grinning, Teutonic German. And so my approach was to highlight these conflicting accounts, to sort of read along the grain and show how they are coming up and how they are conflicting, but also to juxtapose them and to craft a multivocal narrative that could take into account the perspectives of perpetrators, of victims, of bystanders on all sides. So I'll briefly go through the chronology of the book, or not so briefly, and I'm surely going to leave out many important details or some parts of the story. So I'm happy to address anything that doesn't quite make sense or anything you're curious about in questions afterwards. And then at the end of the talk, I'll go over some takeaways about what we can learn, or what I think, at least I learned, about studying this microcosm of the German-Soviet apocalypse. And so here is a postcard of interwar Königsberg. The city doesn't look like this much now, but you can see that it is a sort of a city that, from its postcard depictions, very much highlighted the port. And so the first two chapters of my book focus on a sort of big sweeping history of Königsberg, charting the history of the city and the surrounding province's transformation. Those two things were always interconnected, so it's not just an urban history. Over the first half of the 20th century, from the First World War to the point in the Second World War that the region's fates begin to turn. Königsberg had been founded by the Teutonic Knights in the Middle Ages, and it began as, very intentionally, as a fortress for plundering Slavic and Baltic tribes to the east. But over time, over the years, it developed into a port city that facilitated trade between the Russian and German empires. And throughout the book, I allude to imagery of bridges, of bulwarks. Some of you might be familiar with the 7 bridges of Königsberg problem, the mathematical problem, apology about crossing bridges of the city. And because I show how the inhabitants of this city, not only in Königsberg, but also in Kaliningrad, to a lesser extent, but still, varyingly presented this place as either a gateway to the outside world or as a fortress guarding against it. And World War I shattered both the Russian and German empires and radically transformed this region. Most importantly, the Russian Revolution meant the complete collapse of Königsberg's eastern trading networks. The war and then the revolution were totally disastrous for this region, which was already suffering some economic decline as agriculture was changing with globalization. And after the war, the architects of Versailles ceded once German territory to create the now infamous Polish corridor. You can see this on a map from the book. This is the Polish corridor was designed to give the newly independent Polish state access to the Baltic Sea, very fair and good, but it separated Königsberg from the mainland of Germany. And it left East Prussia, still part of Germany, surrounded by hostile new neighbors, Poland and Lithuania, whose activists sought to claim parts of the province as their own, as they could, quite rightly, point out that many inhabitants spoke either dialects of Polish or had Lithuanian ancestry. So you can see here, this is the Masurian region. This is all now in Poland today, but this is very prominently Polish speaking. Up here, still some Lithuanian speakers and heritage speakers over time. So it's really a polyglot place, like much of this part of the world. A forced plebiscite over the border regions in 1920, along with economic hardship, created a siege mentality among East Prussians, among Königsbergers, who feared both Polish incursion and a Bolshevik-backed communist revolution, either from abroad or from within. And I likewise interweave this concept of siege mentalities throughout the book to show how isolation, economic hardship, and political turmoil led inhabitants in both cases, also in Kaliningrad, to suspect that they were surrounded by enemies and under attack. The Nazis were latecomers to this scene. Despite the extreme popularity of nationalist parties after the First World War, as of the corridor, the Nazis in 1928 had their absolute worst turnout in East Prussia in the entire Reich. But gosh, look at that face, right? That's like, oh, what a perfect Nazi. I know. Past Erich Koch, the Gauleiter of East Prussia, who was not originally from East Prussia, he came from the Ruhr Valley. But he mobilized this local siege mentality and turned it into a party platform that was so powerful that Hitler later adopted it for the national campaign, this idea of a Polish incursion, right? And that was also part of the start of the Second World War, the idea of a defense against some imagined Polish incursion. By 1933, the Nazis won the majority of the vote in East Prussia. That is over 50%, about 55%. It was the strongest showing in all of Germany. Königsberg's Nazi party imagined that East Prussia's predicament as this under-industrialized agricultural region faced extreme economic hardship made it actually an ideal site for national renewal. And they imagined East Prussia to be, in the words of one of its theorists, a, quote, school of the revolution. It was a place where Germany's rebirth was going to begin. It was going to be tried out there, and the template would then be exported to the rest of the country. They really imagined this. And these local Nazis, this Königsberg circle who joined Erich Koch, were part of the party's left wing, its actual quasi-socialist wing. And their vision was decidedly collectivist and decidedly anti-capitalist. And East Prussia's situation led them to create a local version of National Socialism. And while it was anti-communist, it was surprisingly pro-Bolshevik. Koch and his theorists openly admired the Bolsheviks' big technocratic vision, sort of modernist state planning. They even proposed creating Soviet-style large collective farms for poor East Prussian farmers. And they planned for some, because like in Russia, the soils of East Prussia had very poor grading. And they planned for some future German-Soviet economic partnerships in Eastern Europe, which they, of course, very chauvinistically imagined would be led by Germans and probably would need to be brought about by force. But they sort of imagined this German-Soviet space that would sort of bring Königsberg back into prominence. Secondly, while it was East Prussia's isolation that allowed Nazi leader Erich Koch to amass great power. He styled himself as a little Führer, as a little Hitler, and he became the most powerful party boss and provincial leader. He was both roles combined in the whole Reich, because of this isolation of the region. But despite all the grand visions, plans, and attempts to end unemployment, the Nazis achieved very actual lasting, I mean, none of it last, but transformations of the economy or the built environment before the start of the war. The biggest change they actually carried out was to redefine radically the terms for inclusion in the German nation. They were extreme German nationalists. They were radical anti-Semites, just like the other Nazis. But this region's peculiar borderland makeup and its mixed ethnic inheritance with Polish and Lithuanian speakers led them to read German. Instead of focusing on so-called German blood and biological race, they understood Germanness to be a matter of will and self-determination, to use the language of Versailles, right? National self-determination, drawing on the fact that this plebiscite of over 90% of the people in these Polish-speaking regions chose to remain in Germany. That meant that the region's Polish and Lithuanian speakers could indeed be deemed German by virtue of being loyal to the German state and to the idea of Germanness, even if they didn't speak that language at home. But they didn't offer this opportunity to even the most patriotic and nationalist of German Jews, of whom there were many in Königsberg. And they eagerly and violently oppressed Jews in order to curry Hitler's favor. Once the war started, Koch and Königsberg's Nazis willingly fused their peculiar visions with those of Berlin, and they found it more important to follow Hitler than they did to maintain their own local visions for Nazi rule. And this loyalty to Hitler allowed Koch and his regional party to amass great power during the war. And East Prussia first extended its territory in 1939 by annexing chunks of Poland and Belarusia directly, as you can see in the diagonal lines there, 4 and 5, 3. I'm sorry, 3 and 4. And then after 1941, that part of Bialystok increasingly there. And then Koch became the Reichskommissar of Nazi-occupied Ukraine, the civilian leader of that part of Nazi-occupied Ukraine, and he appointed his followers into leading roles in the administration. And so you can see there is a sort of East Prussian dominated, informally dominated region of control all the way from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. And I wish I had had more time to do work on this. This should be another book. It's a very small part of my story. This informal empire and its wartime expansion constituted a continuation of the nepotistic dynamics of East Prussian rule at home and an escalation of the violent politics of exclusion, both at home and abroad. And here you can see Koch, he rarely spent time in Ukraine. He mostly stayed in Königsberg. His health wasn't good. But here he is in Ukraine, sort of examining the national costume of the woman. And this sort of unpleasant encounter, I think, really encapsulates a lot of, in many ways, these early wartime occupations of these regions that became part of East Prussia and then informally ruled as occupations set precedents that shaped the national practices. The first wartime experiments in euthanasia and the first ghettoizations and massacres of the Holocaust on Polish soil were happening in these places. Let's skip ahead a little bit. As the tide of the war changed and the Red Army marched across East Prussia in the spring of 1945, they saw themselves, as I mentioned earlier, as liberators of all of humanity from fascism, as anti-fascists. So this word has become very prominent again in recent war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And you can see in this image, this very famous image, because East Prussia was the first place that they crossed. I'm trying not to leave this microphone. First place they the Soviet soldiers crossed Germany, this much awaited moment after years of suffering, years of war. And so you can hear some soldiers of the Red Army. Ahead of you is the lair of the fascist beast, and they would all pose, and of course these would be stage photos that would go into the newspapers, and so often they would have someone who looked a little like Stalin, sort of represented multi-ethnic nature of the Soviet Union. And so there was always a sort of Stalin-esque Georgian there ready to pose, right? And you can see, this is sort of photograph to the sort of propaganda encapsulation of it. And they did indeed project an image of, especially before the soldiers were moving on closer to Berlin, East Prussia as the most fascist place in Germany, the birthplace of fascism. There are even historians theorizing, that through the Teutonic Knights and through the sort of Hohenzollern monarchy and for various reasons, this was the birthplace of fascism. And you could trace it from time immemorial. And so there was this idea that they were here to destroy fascism, whether it was a new or old thing. But there was also an idea, and they saw themselves, the Soviet soldiers, more nationally, if not ethnically, as defenders of a Soviet motherland, which was sometimes projected as Slavic, sometimes projected as multi-ethnic. And these overlapping views, as I show in my book, were part of these two larger tendencies within a very complex bouquet of Soviet socialist ideology during the Stalin period. And I very sort of coarsely break them down into an internationalist tendency. This very familiar idea from the revolution of 1917, workers of the world unite, right? This idea that even German workers who had been temporarily led astray by the Hitler clique could be redeemed because it was the liberation of the working classes. And that combined with a more nationalist tendency, which was in many ways part of a revival of Russian ethnic and national identity in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. And this idea also grew during the war. It was mobilized in the propaganda campaigns, the idea that this was a primordial battle between a sort of eternally peaceful Russian Slavic Ivan, this sort of simple Slavic peasant, and the preternaturally irredeemably Teutonic Fritz, right? So this was a battle of Ivan versus Fritz, and this kind of a deep ethnic, historic, sort of replay. And those things could be interlapped, it's, interwoven. It's not that one was dominant on the other or one won out over the other. You can see them floating around in the ether. After the war, the Soviet Union inherited the northern third of East Russia and Königsberg in fulfillment of wartime negotiations between Stalin and the Western allies. And from when I researched this in my dissertation to when tried to whittle it down into a book, this is 6 pages, 4 pages, even 2 pages, because they inherited it. Don't worry. What you want to tell in the story, and then how you can sort of get distracted, by in Potsdam, then Tehran, then Yalta, and then Truman said, anyway. The Soviet Union inherited this. I could go over the details. I always think about this. I think I struggled the most to write in half a paragraph. In fulfillment of wartime negotiations between Stalin and the Western allies. That's the reason. And the Soviet Union also importantly inherited almost 200,000 German civilians who remained behind. Numbers vary. Some say 150,000, some say 200,000, some say 250,000. And the Soviets brought all of these complex ideas about what Soviet socialism was, what the Soviet Union was about, with them as they figured out how to make this region and possibly its inhabitants, its remaining inhabitants, Soviet. Kaliningrad was more largely part of the massive westward expansion of the Soviet Union and its sphere of influence as the Soviets exported their revolution to new territories. And this map's a little small here, but you can see. So we think of Sovietization, it's the Western borderlands that become part of the Soviet Union at large, it's the satellite states, and then also what becomes in Germany. So there's many ways that the Soviet sphere of influence expands, and Kaliningrad, this territory that becomes called Kaliningrad, only constitutes about 1% of all of that. All of this new land that Stalin and the Kremlin are now preoccupied with. And so that helps explain a little bit about how little Stalin and Moscow knew about what was going on in Kaliningrad, that context. So keep that in mind. It was the second revolutionary regime to inhabit this isolated, cut-off region in just under 2 decades. But the circumstances were radically different from when the Nazis came in 1933. The city, the countryside were almost completely destroyed. The people living there, soldiers, civilians, prisoners, forced laborers, on the verge of death. The Soviets who came to Kaliningrad, most of them military veterans or still active duty military, were not the original fathers of their revolution like the Königsberg's Nazis were, but the children of it. They brought an intuitive understanding of socialism with them that combined these nationalist and nationalist tendencies within Soviet ideology. And they also brought, very importantly, their experience of the war. But like the Nazis of Königsberg, the Soviets indeed found themselves on the fragile periphery of their empire, isolated from Moscow and left, at least for the first few years, to their own devices, at least partly. And as eager as Stalin had been to claim Königsberg, he really made no plans for it after it was secured, at least from what we can see in the archives, and from what Russian scholars have more archival access than I did, what also they can see in the archives. There was an initial military government, a special military district set up, and it had to establish very quickly rule over a Wild West frontier. They were left only with orders to rebuild agriculture and industry for export, but they were given very few instructions and very little funding, virtually no funding to do it, told to be self-sufficient. So think of this as a sort of a petri dish or some of this kind of cut off island saying, rebuild, we don't have any money for you. We don't have any resources for you. We don't have any manpower for you. Go for it. Most significantly, they received no instruction about what to do with the Germans, either to just bestow Soviet citizenship en masse, which is not as crazy as it sounds, because that's what they did in Lithuania, Latvia, and in Lithuania, there were many active nationalist brigades, sort of guerrilla fighters that were going on for years. There was not much active opposition that past the summer of 45 in Kaliningrad, in Königsberg. They could do that, or they could consider all of Königsberg to be a sort of a forced labor penal colony, but they didn't either. They didn't bestow citizenship on them, and they didn't declare them all to be sort of prisoners or POWs. And so most significantly, this military government received no instruction about what to do with them. And Moscow also made no plans for the Germans' expulsion. So while Germans were being expelled humanely in these wild expulsions across Eastern Europe, there were actually Germans coming back. As 10% of the population that came back, that was there after the war, came back in the summer of 1945 because they were, and then the borders were closed by August after Potsdam. So the local Soviet government, with no instructions from above, was caught in a kind of decision-making vacuum. And this scenario had profound consequences. In the last 5, 6, 7, 3 chapters of my book lay out basically this story, that the region fell, these consequences were that the region fell through the cracks of the post-war budgets, and the Germans' indeterminate status, who are these people and what are they doing, meant that no one felt obligated to provide funds to feed them. The economy of shortages in this region, with disrupted agriculture, with very few supplies, with everything destroyed, it further prolonged the wartime established hierarchy of victors and vanquished, Soviets and Germans, as Soviet administrators necessarily fed and housed their own before feeding the Germans. And Soviet authorities ran the government here and did not incorporate Germans into the administration, as was the case in the Soviet zone of occupation, right? And across the Eastern Europe, it's sort of anti-fascist hopefuls waiting in the wings to become the local face of the new government, right? That's what happened in East Germany. Didn't happen. Most importantly, with no instructions about what to do with the Germans, they had to improvise, and they knew intuitively that the Germans were contaminated with fascism. This was, after all, the lair of the fascist beast. But without this possibility to redeem them collectively, and they weren't thinking on these terms, this is sort of an overlay that I put on the story, right? The bestowal of Soviet citizenship, right? Soviet officials then tried, and you can see this process day by day in the archives, and in various ways, very in decentralized manners, to incorporate the Germans into this nascent Soviet system that they're building, with the implicit idea that the Germans would rehabilitate themselves from fascism individually, right? So there would be no collective en masse liberation. You are all liberated. You're all now Soviet or part of some new anti-fascist government. So there is an individual process that is assumed that could happen. And so I want to go over very cursorily 3 approaches for how they tried to do this. And I'm pointing these out not to show that the Soviets were this benign, do-gooding force, as a Latvian Goodreads review accused me of doing, but using auto-translate, I think that's what she but to correct the story that I often saw in the literature, either that the Soviets just didn't care what happened to the Germans, and so there was this malignant neglect, or that the Soviets intentionally chewed up the Germans through forced labor and then spit them out, expelled them when their labor was no longer useful or needed. So the first way that the Soviet officials, first the military provisional government that operated for about a year, and then the civilian provisional government that followed it once the city was and province were renamed Kaliningrad. The first way they did it was through quote unquote socialist labor. Now, this was actually forced labor. Out of dire necessity, the Soviets instituted a forced labor regime immediately to rebuild the city and to rebuild farms. This was also the case, in the Allied zones of occupation, but the conditions were dramatically worse in Kaliningrad, and with far less aid than either the Soviet zone or the American zone, et cetera, the British zone. And so they built in, indeed, you can see in the documents, incentives for hard work. People, if you overfilled the sort of stock template of socialism, if you overfulfill the plan, you will get extra food rations. Of course, this didn't work in practice because of ongoing shortages. There just wasn't food to go around. But you see individual Soviet leaders at a train car factory, at a farm, trying to encourage good work and reward good work, and occasionally actually rewarding good work. The second way that they did this was through social welfare, to show the Germans the superiority of the socialist Soviet way of life. And so the civilian government that came in mid-1946, very rudimentary, still faced these dire budget constraints, but they worked to incorporate the Germans. They ended the forced labor regime. They announced equal pay for equal work, and see German doctors and nurses in a hospital that was converted into an oblast, so a provincial Kaliningrad hospital, to take care of German children, to also take care of Soviets. And they had co-working organizations. I only touch on this a little bit in the book, but a lot of research I did on trying to get German and Soviet doctors to work together, German and Soviet nurses to work together, and to pay them. And so any engineer of a certain type who was German would get the same pay as a Soviet engineer. Now, the problem was this is often high, except for a few exceptions for like engineers, most work that was specialized required knowledge of Russian, increasingly so as more Soviet settlers came. And so Germans, not because they were often untrained, because it was majority women, some of whom had never been in the workforce before the war. And also because sort of language for advancement was Russian. And so people who didn't speak Russian couldn't necessarily rise the ranks. And so it was the case that Germans were making less money, but a janitor made the same no matter what the nationality. And so you can see these contradictions. But they indeed expanded healthcare. They introduced schools for German children to teach in German language, and they established care for the many orphans in the region. And the final way that they attempted to do this through, so the first, socialist labor, the second was sort of setting an example to incorporate into the system. And the third was sort of direct re-education. So building the model from the Gulag, from POW camps of anti-fascist education, right? These anti-fascist committees that during the war, they did the same thing that locally the military and then civilian government created anti-fascist clubs, made a German language newspaper that reprinted stories from Pravda, but also had local stories written by Germans. And they had Königsberg's very few remaining card-carrying communists deliver workplace lectures about fascist crimes and Soviet superiority. But the problem with all of these approaches was that there was just no clear gauge for success, right? There was no means to determine when an individual German had been redeemed from fascism. How do you know the hearts and minds of an individual? And so it got tied implicitly to how well the city was being rebuilt. Was there a good harvest? Had the Germans worked well? Then, well, yeah, they might be redeeming themselves from fascism. But you can see the vicious cycle of no funding and pressure, right? How this might not work. But indeed, for a brief time, it seemed like Germans and Soviets would live together long-term in Kaliningrad, and no one expected the Germans to be expelled. But there were a few factors that led the new Soviet government to turn against the Germans. In August 1946, Moscow, for various unrelated reasons, and some perhaps strategic early Cold War reasons, initiated a massive new Soviet settlement campaign, very poorly timed, to bring over 200,000 Soviet settlers to Kaliningrad by early 1947. This all happened after the fall harvest in the dead of winter, without sufficient food supplies for the new arrivees. And those people who study this part of the world might know that that winter was one of the coldest on record, and it triggered a Soviet-wide famine, also in Kaliningrad, although arguably Kaliningrad was less bad than some parts of Ukraine and Moldova. Both Germans and Soviets went hungry because the population, even though the harvest had been better, the population grew tremendously, exponentially. And because of an ongoing ethnic hierarchy, it was mainly Germans who died, almost exclusively Germans who died. By the spring of 1947, coming out of this famine, there was pressure on all sides. From below, as new Soviet settlers were disappointed and angry, they compared the visible wealth of former German society, even in ruins, to their own ongoing poverty. They had been told that this place was rich, the streets were lined with fruit trees, that there were going to be houses and farms waiting for them, and they found ruins. There was also pressure from above. Moscow agencies were demanding increased accountability. Local party members, now coming into sort of establishing local party organs, now needed to explain failure in rebuilding from above. We know that the failure to rebuild was because of labor shortages, funding shortages, bottlenecks of supplies, all of these structural reasons. But they could not blame Moscow for any of those. And so to explain why the city had not yet been successfully rebuilt, they turned against the Germans. Despite the fact that the Germans, mostly women and children, presented no organized opposition, local Soviet leaders began accusing them of being hidden fascist enemies, a fifth column, actively preventing Kaliningrad from being rebuilt. They even used the Germans' mass death in the spring of 1947 because they were starving to death out in the streets as proof of their ideological failing. This was their bodies, their illness was not evidence that the Soviet Union had failed to provide them food, but that they were corrupted with fascism and had lost the will to live as fascists in a socialist society. And so their death was even proof of their fascism, right? And although Moscow announced the Germans' impending resettlement that began in the fall of 1947, the drive for expulsion began as part of that process of scapegoating in Kaliningrad, and they attracted Moscow's attention. And by the time of the last mass transports, by the fall of 1948, nearly 40%, I argue, based on the sources I use, of the German population had died. Some older records claim 75% of the Germans who remained after the war had died. I can't support that with the Soviet records that I have, so I can't argue against that number, but I can argue for 40%. This terrible death rate, as I mentioned at the beginning, I do not see as the result of malicious intent, but as the tragic result of wartime destruction, the periphery's new ambiguous status, and this impossible task of rebuilding in isolation. Now, when the Soviet, I'm sorry, I missed a slide. This is the first tram being rebuilt. I think this is the fall of 1946, and a vast majority of the tram drivers were German, because they knew how to drive the trams, because they had been the majority of the population. And when the demographics of the city and the province or the oblast changed dramatically, then there was some friction. Why are Germans driving the trams? This sort of thing, right? Although at first there was cohabitation, they were having banquets. German girls were dancing with Soviet men. And then that was later cast as a sort of ideological failing on the part of the men. But here you can see great plan and disappointing, sort of reality or sort of implementation. This kind of, once Kaliningrad Pravda, a local newspaper, came into being, this kind of civic engagement that is very common in the Soviet Union of sort of using criticism through the newspaper or through letters to the editor to sort of shape policy or to sort of put pressure above or below, really happened right there in the midst of this winter famine, in the midst of this mass settlement. And you can see this. So I can only give a cursory explanation of this, but what I come around to is that in the absence of being able to rebuild Kaliningrad effectively, for all the reasons I listed, as the Soviets were expelling the Germans and as the Germans were leaving, they began, and this is also sort of the incipient early Cold War, right? So this is 1947, 1948. They begin attacking everything in the region that looks German. Could be a German, could be a German sign, could be steeped roofed architecture, could be a swastika. Anything that looks architecturally German or visibly German becomes synonymous with fascism. And there is this sense that there is emerging fascism. The germ seed of fascism from East Prussia is growing, and that in order for socialism to win, they need to get rid of all the fascism. The fascism becomes synonymous with anything German. And just as fascism becomes synonymous as German, socialism and victory over fascism becomes Russification. And so making a steep roof building look more like a sort of neoclassical facade, adding some columns to make it look Stalinist, that is socialist. And so what happens is that these two ideas, fascism, anti-fascism, socialism, are in this defining binary with each other, and the terms keep changing. And ultimately, they settle on a very ethnic definition of what socialist is and who can be part of it and what it looks like. And it looks very much like Russia. Making this place socialist, making Kaliningrad socialist, you can see in the speeches, becomes about making it Russian. And so the Soviets who had come here to build a socialist city on the ruins of fascism, right, to claim to replace this ethnic exclusivity with international humanism, and who had even tried to redeem their former German enemy, ultimately determined that their German enemy was irredeemably fascist, eternally fascist. And they ended up, paradoxically, or perhaps predictably, building a Slavic national homeland with ethnic requirements for membership. So they, in other words, they destroyed Nazi Königsberg, but they rebuilt Kaliningrad on the same ethnic foundations. And so in conclusion, what do we get? What did I get? Studying Nazism and Stalinism in dialogue. First, and this might seem obvious, but I hope that my book does justice to it in practice, is to show how local context plays a very powerful role. And local context does not just mean an economic determinism or a geographical determinism. And I don't really sort of come down, the side of being Marxist or structuralist or anything like that, but the place matters. The actual place matters in the way the ideologies are articulated and the way they are put into practice and transformed. And the geography of this region fostered a lot of similarities between these two regimes. And I don't think that you can just say in a big comparative history way, Nazism and Stalinism are the same because of what happened in Kaliningrad. But you can say, but what happened in Königsberg, Kaliningrad, the geography of this place, isolation, a sense of being a periphery, of being a borderland, economic hardship, a sense of siege mentality, of hostile ideology, those things fostered similarities in the expression of the politics of inclusion and inclusion. And the local adaptations in the terms for belonging, what it meant to be German, who got to be part of that, what it meant to be Soviet and who got to be part of that, reveal in both cases the internal contradictions, the messiness of Nazi ideology, of Soviet ideology, particularly when it comes to inclusion and exclusion. But there were local manifestations. They also reveal the important differences between the two regimes. I didn't talk about this story in the talk today, but the ways in which Hitler and Stalin dealt with the leaders of these regimes differed very dramatically. The ways in which the personalities, local personalities operated on the ground differed very dramatically. And you can see some of the mechanics of the Nazi Party and its way of interacting with the state, the Communist Party and its way of interacting with the state and society playing out in different ways. And finally, these internal contradictions, these local adaptations become all the more heightened in the violence of the war and these politics of exclusion and the terms for belonging in the nation or in the revolutionary project become particularly heightened in times of escalating violence. So thank you very much. I really appreciated the chance to talk, and I would love to hear your comments and questions and clarify anything that might need clarification. Thank you.